Welcome everyone to the League of Women Voters Pros and Cons Election Forum. I'm Georgia Derr, and I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Alameda. And before we begin tonight's forum, a couple of announcements. First, if you saw our ad in the paper and you're here because in addition to the pros and cons, you were hoping to hear the candidates for Alameda County Superior Court Judge, District Number 11, Tara Flanagan and Karen Katz. We had a scheduling conflict. So they will be attending another forum that we're scheduling on May 24th from 7 to 9, and the venue is to be determined. So please, we encourage you to go to our website and see what's coming up. And the May 3rd forum that you may have seen in the newspaper as well, sadly is also canceled. Again, scheduling conflicts. It's very hard to get everyone lined up. But we have May 10th and May 24th still in the lineup. And before we begin, a little plug about the League of Women Voters. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan, political organization that is open to men and women. We've been around for nearly 100 years, and we have been doing the same work for 100 years. And that is twofold: to encourage active and informed citizen participation in our government, which is what tonight is all about. It's learning about what's on the ballot for June 5th, the measures that are on the ballot, the pros and cons. This is an educational forum, wearing our voter service hat. And the other component of the League is advocacy or action. And based on League studies and positions, we advocate for measures that benefit our communities and help to protect our democracy. So we separate the two. This is our voter service right here. You'll be hearing pros and cons. But if you go to the other side of the room, the League of Women Voters actually, based on policy, based on positions, we do have recommendations for the ballot measures, with the exception of Measure A, the county measure, and the Alameda County Council of Leagues, that is 6 leagues in the county, will be voting whether or not to support, oppose, or be neutral on Measure A. But all of the other measures we do have recommendations for. We will not be talking about recommendations at this forum. If you sneak over there, you will find them. But that is separate. Tonight's forum is just the pros and cons, simply voter education. And with that, no further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator for this evening, and she is our Vice President of Program, Michele Ellson. So please give her a hand. Thank you.
Oh, whoops. I'm just going to adjust that. Okay. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight. The focus of the forums this evening will be the 7 state ballot measures, 1 regional measure, and 1 countywide measure. First, we're going to give you some housekeeping rules. Number 1, each measure will be presented and your questions can be written on the cards being distributed. Where are our card distributors?
Right here.
All right, these folks will be distributing cards for your questions. Cards and pencils, oh, we got that part. I will then propose the questions to the presenter. The question reviewers are Heather Fowler-Salamini and Georgia Derr. Next page. Each measure has been allocated about 15 minutes. Our timer is located in the front row. She's tough, she's ready to go. She'll track the total time and keep us all on track. And anybody who doesn't stay on track may never be heard from again. No, I'm kidding. We'll have a 5-minute break at about 8 p.m. so that we can all stand up and breathe for a moment. We are recording this event, and the video will be posted on our website. So for the folks who are home tonight missing out on this, that will be your chance to check this out and figure out all of this good stuff about the ballot measures. We're going to ask that no other audio-video recording be made of the event. You may see 1 or 2 of the League members taking photos. These are for our use on our website and other social media. As background, the following are the criteria used by the League of Women Voters as they analyze proposed ballot measures. That's better. Okay. Examine what the measure seeks to accomplish. Do you agree with those goals? Is the measure consistent with your ideas about government? Do you think the proposed changes will make things better? Who are the real sponsors and opponents of the measure? Check where the money is coming from on plug time, Voters Edge California website, and that's votersedge.org/CA for California. Next thing that we'd be looking at is whether the measure is written well. Will it create conflicts in law that may require court resolution or interpretation? Is it good government, or will it cause more problems than it will resolve? Does the measure create its own revenue source? Does it earmark, restrict, or obligate government revenues? If so, weigh the benefit of securing funding for this measure against the cost of reducing overall flexibility in the budget. Does the measure mandate a government program or service without addressing how it will be funded? Does the measure deal with one issue that can easily be decided by a yes or no vote, or is it a complex issue that should be thoroughly examined in the legislative arena? If the measure amends the Constitution, consider whether it really belongs in the Constitution. Would a statute accomplish the same purpose? All constitutional amendments require voter approval. What we put into the Constitution would have to come back to the ballot to be changed. It's kind of like that tattoo. You better really love it. You better really love it. Be wary of distortion tactics and commercials that rely on image but tell nothing of substance about the measure. Beware of half-truths. Okay, we begin with Prop 68. Should the state sell $4.1 billion in bonds to fund parks, natural resources protection, climate adaptation, water quality and supply, and flood protection? Our presenter is Ruth Dixon-Mueller. Give her a hand.
Thank you, Michelle. Proposition 68 is an omnibus measure that involves a bond that the state would issue worth $4.1 billion to fund parks, natural resources, climate adaptation, water quality and supply, and flood protection. So the question is, should the state sell these bonds? This is $4 billion in new bonds and $100 million previously authorized but unsold bonds. And what's interesting on Voters Edge is it says the amount includes $4 million in new bonds, but it's actually $4 billion in new bonds. So there's a little slight error on the proposal. So what's the situation? California actually operates programs to protect the environment now, obviously, conserves natural resources, prevent floods, ensure safe drinking water, other water-related programs in parks. And we may not realize that the state also provides grants and loans to local governments and other organizations for similar programs. So currently, almost $5 billion is spent each year on programs such as these. And this money comes from a combination of the sale of general obligation bonds issued by the state, some revenue from fees, and the state's general fund, which is the state's main operating fund. So during the past 17 years, the voters have actually approved almost $27 billion in general obligation bonds for various natural resource projects. And of this, the state still has about $9 billion available. Most of that money is available for water quality, supply, and infrastructure purposes. And this was authorized by Proposition 1 in the year 2014. So these general obligation bonds are actually sold to investors, and they're paid off from the state's general fund. And the state repays the principal and interest over time, often taking up several decades. So the proposal here is to provide additional funding to state departments and to local agencies for specific natural resource related purposes. The money is designated for a wide range of projects across the state, including natural resource and wildlife conservation, climate preparedness to address the effects of climate change, coastal and river improvements, maintenance of creation of parks and recreation projects, and water quality and groundwater preservation. Now, Proposition 68 also requires at least 15 to 20% of the funds that should be used for specific disadvantaged communities. So this is a method of directing funds to especially communities where they don't have safe drinking water or are exposed to other environmental issues that need to be addressed. All right, so what is this going to cost? The fiscal effect, repaying the bonds, is expected to cost an estimated $200 million every year. This comes out of the general tax revenues of the state, and it's going to take about 40 years to pay off, resulting in a total cost of almost double, that is about $7.8 billion. On the other hand, they're arguing here that there may be savings to local governments in tens of millions of dollars because the bond money available will relieve local governments from paying for all or at least part of some of the projects they're involved in. So what we're talking about then is money that comes out of the general fund to pay off these debts that are going to be accrued. I don't think that I need to go into all the details of exactly what is going to be funded, so especially since I'm already getting signs. So yes, on Proposition 68, I'm going to take less time in the next proposition if I can borrow a little time for this one. Arguments for the obviously, we know that California faces more frequent and severe droughts, wildfires, and so on. So all of this, including unpredictable weather and so on, is going to be addressed, presumably, with the funds that come out of Prop 68. Protect drinking water quality, safeguarding water supplies, preparing us for droughts, bringing clean, safe drinking water and parks to communities in need, clearing up severely contaminated local water supplies, safeguarding rivers, lakes, and streams, protecting our coast, natural resources, parks. And so you can see that it is an omnibus bill, but the people who argue in favor do say that it's got strict accountability and oversight and broad bipartisan support. So I'm just going to borrow on my next one by saying that the supporters include the California Chamber of Commerce, Association of California Water Agencies, League of California Cities, Nature Conservancy, and the League of Women Voters of California. They are listed here as supporters. So a little bit about the money that's been spent. This money is all coming on the yes side. There is no money reported yet on the no side. So the yes side has about almost $5 million from big organizations, mostly like Nature Conservancy, Save the Redwoods League, Peninsula Open Space Trust, and some individuals, Julie Packard, Nancy Burnett, and Earhart. So that does not mean, however, that there is no opposition. There is opposition, even though there's no funding. And the opponents are arguing that, first of all, not enough is going to go to the parks, that the money is going to be distributed probably unfairly and unequally across the state, that California has enough debt, and that the last thing that California needs is more debt, and that this is bound to increase the overall spending and end up increasing our taxes in the future. So that is Proposition 68. And now I will turn to Proposition 69 and speak more quickly, which is, should the legislature be required to dedicate and direct revenues from the Road Repair and Accountability Act of 2017, that is Senate Bill 1, to transportation purposes and exempt this revenue from California's annual spending limit? Now, this is a constitutional amendment, and it's a little bit strange because Senate Bill 1 was passed that increased across the board funding for transportation purposes from taxes and fees, diesel excise taxes, increased gasoline taxes, and so on and so forth. But the problem is that apparently there is a tendency for the state to borrow from these funds because they are not totally protected and not totally dedicated to the transportation purposes for which they were intended. So the proposal, Proposition 69, would try to correct this by restricting the new diesel sales tax revenue and the transportation improvement fee from the Senate Bill 1 to be used solely for transportation purposes, and it would prohibit borrowing from this account, and it would allow the revenues from Senate Bill 1 to be excluded from California's spending limit, which replaces an upper bound on money that can be spent from tax proceeds. Fiscally, there's no effect whatsoever. It doesn't change the tax and the fee rates. It just simply says you have to spend them on the purposes for which they are intended. Arguments for. So, yes, on 69, prevent the legislature from redirecting transportation revenues and ensure they can be used only to fund improvements. It won't raise taxes, and it will require transportation funds to be spent on priorities like fixing local roads, highways, bridges, and other transportation purposes. And like the previous proposition, the funding is all on the yes side. The first one listed here is the funding is all on the yes side, and it's basically by large organizations. For example, the California Alliance for Jobs. This is seen as a way of really increasing the number of construction jobs on transportation. The County Supervisors Association, State Building and Construction, Trades, and so on. All of the funding comes from California. It's all large contributions and no individuals. So, among the supporters, League of Women Voters of California, California Chamber of Commerce, California State Conference of the NAACP, League of California Cities, so on, Transportation California. So there's strong bipartisan support for this. I'll just end up with the arguments against. There are two kinds of arguments. One is that it's not strict enough and that there's still some loopholes. The second is that it's not really necessary. Because the legislature should be doing what they're supposed to be doing anyway. So I'll sum up with this. How insulting, this is an argument against. I love this one. How insulting can a ballot proposition be? Last year, a 2/3 majority of state legislators voted for a gas tax and vehicle fee increase for transportation improvements. And now they're asking you to tell them only to spend the money on intended purposes. Do you see the lunacy of this request? So he goes on and on. It's quite wonderful. This is Senator John Moorlach, and he gives his argument, is this supposed to make us feel better or what? Anyway, in the end, he says, I'm voting no on this tripe called Proposition 69. You should too. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's see, next up, Proposition 70, should A, California's cap and trade greenhouse gas reduction disbursements, and B, a related partial sales tax exemption be made subject to a 2/3 vote in the state legislature in 2024 to continue the program and the exemption. This one will be presented by Kathryn Saenz-Duke.
Okay, Proposition 70, the title, which will be an interesting fact to discuss a bit later, the title is Requires Legislative Supermajority Vote Approving Use of the Cap and Trade Reserve Fund, and this is a constitutional amendment. Now let me give you a little bit of background. Last July, the California Legislature authorized our state's cap and trade program until 2030. This is a key component of our state's attempt to mitigate the effect of climate change. As you probably know, the California program gives emission credits to greenhouse gas producers who purchase these credits based on the amount of greenhouse gases they're emitting. The funds from these credits are then allocated through the budget process, which is done by, this is important, a majority vote, which is basically 50% plus one. This year, 60% of the cap and trade funds were allocated to high-speed rail, which we know is a great favorite of our governors, sustainable community grants, affordable housing, many other projects, and the other 40% of the cap and trade funds supports a variety of programs such as more environmental things like sustainable forests, wetlands, and reducing methane emissions from livestock manure, one of my favorites. So currently, the funds are allocated from the cap and trade fund on a simple majority vote of the legislature. What this proposition is all about is changing that to a 2/3 vote, which, as you can imagine, has some implications in terms of having the vote go through. Under this proposition, starting in 2024, the greenhouse gas permit revenues would be put into a new special fund. So 6 years later, we would create this new fund. And in this fund, the deposits would continue until there is a bill passed by a 2/3 vote, not a majority vote, to allocate the funds. So this is interesting. And what's also interesting is that about a month ago, we found out the title, which was given by the Attorney General of this measure, which was, let me get this right, limits the legislature's authority to use cap and trade revenue to reduce pollution. When the Attorney General issued this title for the ballot measure, one of the 7 Republicans who had supported the cap and trade program and gone against their party, joining a majority of the Democrats, he filed a lawsuit stating that the measure does not limit the legislature's authority and that all proposition would do is change the voting threshold from a majority to 2/3. And what this means politically is that the Democrats would have to have Republican votes unless there's a huge shift in the legislature. So now we get back to the settlement that was made by the parties, which takes us back to the original title of the measure. Requires a legislative supermajority vote approving use of cap and trade reserve funds. So the arguments for this are signed by our governor, Jerry Brown, the president of the California Chamber of Commerce, Chad Mays, this Republican who crossed party lines and voted for a cap and trade bill. Shortly after that, he was no longer the Assembly Republican leader, so he presumably paid a price for that. But he's supporting this ballot measure. What I found especially interesting is that there is a website for this called yesonproposition70.com. 3 days ago, 2 days ago, and today, I looked onto this website to see what they say. And I was told that the resource you're looking for has been removed, had its name changed, or is temporarily unavailable. So for reasons that I do not understand, there does not seem to be any content on the URL for the website in support of this measure. The arguments against this are that California voters changed in 2010, moving from a 2/3 to a majority vote to pass a budget. And by requiring a supermajority vote of the legislature to allocate our cap and trade funds in the future, a small minority of politicians can divert funds away from environmental priorities. What's especially troubling, I think particularly to a presentation such a group as this, is that Prop 70 was a, quote, backroom deal. It normally takes about 9 months to get a bill through the legislature, to have hearings, public testimony. This measure passed in only 4 days with no hearing and no opportunity for public comment. Opponents include the League of Women Voters of California, California League of Conservation Voters, Sierra Club California, and many other environmental groups. So Marion has given me the evil eye, so I will end now. Do you want me to do the next ballot measure, the regional measure as well? Okay. So we're going from statewide to regional, and this is called Regional Measure Number 3. It would raise tolls on the 9 Bay Area County bridges, except for Golden Gate, which is apparently independent. And these tolls would raise by $3 over 6 years. The money that would come from these toll increases would be $4.5 billion for highway and transit projects and $60 million a year for new bus and ferry services and for our Transbay Transit Center in San Francisco. Now, there have been 2 other regional measures in the past, and for time's sake, I'll just skip over them and say that the overview of Regional Measure 3 is that there would be $1.5 billion funding regional projects and $2.9 billion funding corridor-specific projects. The most expensive capital item would be $500 million for 300 new BART cars. Supporters say this measure would reduce truck traffic congestion, extend BART to San Jose and Silicon Valley, improve Transbay bus service and carpool access, and provide money to plan and design a second Transbay rail crossing, which of course is especially interesting to us in Alameda, since there has been talk that we might be part of this second Transbay rail crossing. There are very strong opponents to this measure, particularly a group called Transportation Solutions Defense and Education Fund, who says that this would encourage solo drivers because the measure would convert some of the high occupancy vehicle lanes to the variable toll fee lanes, which could allow solo drivers even more to use what are basically the diamond lanes now. There's also an argument that this measure would hurt low-income drivers who cannot afford to live closer to their workplace, who therefore have long commutes, and they have to pay bridge tolls increases on top of that. So the Bay Bridge would go up to $9 per crossing, and the other bridges, with the exception of Golden Gate, who is apart, would be $8 per crossing. There is also a lot of concern about a lack of clarity and oversight regarding the funding process. So, League of the Women Voters of Bay Area has sent a letter, I believe this was a month ago, saying that, and now this will be a quote, "We want to see the most improvements possible and not have funding attached to projects with lengthy implementation. There must be opportunity for new projects to be considered. There must be details about how funds will be received and administered and public participation opportunities. There should be success criteria and measurement of those criteria. And the oversight committee should inform the public how and if objectives are being met." As I mentioned earlier, this nonprofit environmental organization seems to be leading the charge for the opponents, and their website is called occupymtc.org. MTC stands for Metropolitan Transportation Commission. Another interesting political development, at least interesting to me, is that U.S. Representative Mark DeSaulnier, who is a Democrat from Concord, serves now on the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure and previously chaired the California Senate and Assembly Committees on Transportation. So this guy knows something about that. A few months ago, he and Senator Feinstein issued a joint press release talking about the need for addressing transportation congestion in the Bay Area, but saying in this joint press release that nothing was more important than having a second Transbay crossing. Now, I mention this to say that it's interesting to note that for this measure, Representative DeSaulnier is an opponent and Dianne Feinstein is a supporter. So there are a number of local supporters of the measure, including Supervisor Wilma Chan, 2 of our council members, Malia Vega and Jim Odie, not our mayor, but the Berkeley, Oakland, and San Jose mayors, and the League of Women Voters of the Bay Area, among others. So my time has come to an end. Are there any questions? Are there any questions? There are. Okay.
So we've got one question about RM3, which I'll read, and then one question about Prop 70, which actually I'm going to take that one. So we've got a couple that I'll handle through housekeeping, but your question for RM3 starts with a statement. In 1962, voters approved BART with a plan to have 40 trains running in each direction per hour. Today it only runs 16 trains per hour and still hasn't reached San Jose. Representative DeSaulnier, as you pointed out, was previously chair of the California Senate Assembly, one of the transportation committees. Not sure if it was Senate and Assembly. It was both. Okay, thank you. He opposes RM3 because previous projects involved billions in wasteful cost overruns. How do you counter his claim that there's not enough transparency or accountability to support this bill?
Well, first of all, as I pointed out, I think it's interesting that he and Senator Feinstein have come together on some issues but are on opposite sides here. I give credit to the League, I was not involved in this, for sending this letter and publicly saying there has to be a lot more accountability and oversight in this group. And so I'm not sure quite what else to say about this particular representative, except that people are on opposite sides of this, even though they all seem to be working toward the same goal.
You're all set. Thank you so much. So just a couple of things. We have a question here for Prop 70 that says, which senators support Prop 70? And it's going to be a pretty long list, and I think you probably include assembly members as well. So I'm going to give you guys a quick rundown on how you would find that information, because rather than have you guys listen to me read a list for 10 minutes, you can actually, the state legislature has a website. It's, hold on a second, leginfo.legislature.ca.gov. So what you're going to want to do is figure out what bill brought us the magic of Proposition 70. You can look in there and it will give you a list of how every state senator and assembly person voted on that particular bill to put that measure on the ballot. So if it went through the legislative process, that is how you would get that information. Also, somebody asked for a definition of omnibus bill. Dictionary definition pertaining to, including, or dealing with numerous objects or items at once. And just to give you an example, every year the state has omnibus budget bills, and so they'll have an omnibus, say, for education, and it'll have a rundown with all of the different types of expenditures and increasingly a lot of policy stuff too, like the local control funding formula, which is the new-ish funding formula for schools. That's something that was a policy measure that was included in the omnibus bill. So there's our housekeeping stuff. And if anybody wants me to walk them through how to find that on the legislature's website, I'm happy to do that after the show. Next up is Bill Smith. He will inform us about Prop 72. Title, question, should the value of new construction of rain capture systems be excluded from reassessment of property for property tax purposes?
Well, Proposition 72 is a unique bill. It has to be unique because it's brought together the League of California Cities and the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association in support of it. And it's also unique because it was started by a woman who put a big tank in her backyard in Walnut Creek. And so then she went to a meeting, a community meeting like this, and was attended by her state senator, Steve Glazer, and she was complaining about why she was putting in money to save water for the state and to capture it from the rainwater in her backyard, and the state was going to increase her property taxes. And so that's what this proposition is about. It's to exempt from the property tax improvements designed to collect stormwater systems. And it exempts them for 10 years from January 2019 till the end of 2028. And it would also, and so as long as the owner who installed that system there, it's exempt. As soon as the property is sold, then that rainwater collection system will then, the value will then be counted towards the assessment for the property and the value. So that's some of that's the basics of what it is about now. To give you a sense of the kind of the scale of it, 1,500 square foot roof will capture about 10,000 gallons of water in a year when it rains 12 inches a year, as it does in San Jose. So, and a family, if it uses 100 gallons a day of water, which is a small family or one that uses it very efficiently, that's about $36,000 gallons a year, so that's 25% of water for a year. Plus, you can capture a lot of it for agriculture. So it has some good appeal for that reason. Now, these systems cost from a few $100s for a backyard family like Judith Glazers, or Judith Adlers, who started this, and then to several $100,000 for large agricultural operations who put these systems in. And then the amount of tax it generates, it's about 1.1% of the basic value of that. And there are precedents, fire extinguishers and fire sprinklers and seismic retrofitting and solar panels are currently also exempt when they're installed along the same ways. This proposition would amend the state constitution. As most of us know, anything to do with property taxes in the state the legislature has to go to the voters for a constitutional amendment for it. The effect on the state budget is pretty minimal. It will lower property taxes for property owners who install the rainwater systems, which means it'll have a little less for the local governments, but it will overall be a small statewide effect, estimated to be less than several $1 million a year. So they don't expect a lot of these to be installed. The basic arguments for it, that California needs more water storage for future droughts, and homeowners should not be penalized for installing rainwater capture systems. It'll result in lower water bills for the homeowner, and perhaps more saving, increased demand for expansion of water, public utility supply, drinking water, and agricultural irrigation. The endorsements for it are the League of California Cities, Save the Bay, Planning and Conservation League, Trout Unlimited, the Mercury News, Sacramento Bee, and then also the Howard Jarvis Taxpayers Association. The official ballot argument is written by David Lewis, the Save the Bay Executive Director, and Howard Penn, the Planning and Conservation League. And the people who have argued against this, no organizations. And the only argument on the comment on the Sacramento, in the San Jose Mercury News against it was very general. It said, state funding shortfalls, especially in pensions, mean property taxes should be raised, not lowered. So, that's the best argument I've seen against it. So again, just to sum this up, it's an initiative that's supported by nearly everyone, and it's good. And here's a picture of Judith Adler in her Walnut Creek backyard with her tank in the background. So.
Bill, thanks a lot. Just a reminder to everybody, if you have questions about anything, go ahead and grab a card from one of our wonderful question card folks. And, I just wanted to back up for a minute. While I was listening to Bill give his awesome presentation about Prop 72, I looked, and it looks like the bill that put 70 on the ballot was ACA 1. And what you can do is enter that bill name into the main page of the state legislature's website, and then there'll be tabs at the top, and just click votes. And then you'll see everybody who voted for and against that measure or that bill. And just as a quick reference, locally it looks like Nancy Skinner, who is our state senator, voted for it, and Rob Bonta, who is our state assemblyman, voted against. Moving on, next measure is Prop 71. Question is, should ballot measures approved by a majority of voters take effect 5 days after the Secretary of State certifies the results of the election? And our presenter is Kate Quick.
I'm actually going to present two measures. I assume the second one will be after the break. Okay, because it's going to be complicated, and this particular measure is an easy one. As Michele said, this proposition would change the effective date of adoption of measures that go on the ballot to 5 days after the vote has been certified, rather than at present immediately after voting day. So what's happening now is that measures that we vote on take effect the day after we vote. What's happened in between is that now over 50%, and in some counties such as ours, even more than that, over 60% of voters are voting by mail. So the registrars of voters have a certain number of days, 38 days, after an election to certify the results of the election. That seems like a long time, but having worked for Alameda County, I know that when people vote by mail particularly, those votes are counted last. So they come in these huge numbers on voting day, and then the vote by mail votes that come in, especially if they're left at the polling place on the dates, because a lot of people don't mail them in ahead of time. They wait, they go to the polls, and they drop off their envelope. Those are the ones that are counted last. So they have to match the signature on the envelope that you sign to the computer. So the ones that come in earlier are processed and they're released, actually those are released first. But the ones that are turned in on voting day, and that percentage is getting larger and larger with the number of people that are voting by mail. This is what we used to call absentee ballots. So that it takes a long time for the worker bees at the registrar of voters office to open the envelopes, separate the ballot from the envelope, check, before they do that, they have to check the signature to make sure that it's a verified voter. So what this would do is allow for all the votes to be counted and certified before a measure takes effect. It's pretty straightforward. The legislative analyst and the budget analyst say this isn't going to have much impact, if any, on the budget. It's a constitutional amendment. So when it went through the state legislature, interestingly enough, everybody in the state legislature, in both the Assembly and the state Senate, voted for it except for one guy, Gary Wesley, who's a Democrat, and he voted against it. And he also was the only person to write an statement, thank you for the word, it flew right out of my head, an anti-statement, which I won't read you the whole thing, but I think it's kind of interesting that he went through all of the things that were in the measure, and then his last ending thing here says, while the summary is correct, some folks may wonder whether the legislature is addressing a real problem with the existing constitutional language adopted way back in 1970. No law enacted by the voters can ever take effect before the outcome of the vote has been determined. As currently written, the language makes changes retroactive to the day after an election unless the enacted change otherwise provides. And sometimes in these things we vote on, it says this becomes effective January next year, so we vote on that. The amendments proposed by the measure would eliminate such an early and retroactive effective date for a law enacted by state voters. Why is this measure needed? So that his big objection is he doesn't think it matters. So that's pretty much all there is to that. It's a very straightforward thing, and it doesn't seem to have much impact other than the fact that it allows us to wait until all the votes are counted before a measure becomes enforceable. So I have one other measure, Measure A, a county measure, to do, and we're going to do that after the break. Michele, do you want to introduce the break?
You heard it right. We're going to take a 5-minute break. It's going to be the 7th inning stretch, more or less. And we'll be right back. Oh, Ruth's going to make a quick announcement.
I know you're waiting for your break, but I just want to refer you to a piece of paper also on the table there along with the recommendations, which is Voter Information Resources Online. And please pick this up because it's really useful, and it's got the websites and content description: League of Women Voters USA, California, Bay Area, Alameda, got the California Secretary of State, Alameda County Registrar of Voters, City of Alameda, and Voter's Edge. So gives you all the websites and a little description of what's on each of those sites. So please pick one up. Thanks.
So our final measure, Kate will introduce us to Alameda County Measure A, quote, to expand access to childcare and preschool for low and middle income families, help homeless and at-risk children, including help preventing child abuse and neglect, attract and retain quality childcare workers, and add spaces for childcare at locations throughout the county. Shall the County of Alameda enact a 30-year 0.5% sales tax, providing approximately $140 million annually with citizens' oversight, public disclosure of spending, and mandatory annual audits. Just a reminder, we've got folks who have cards that you can write your burning questions on. And if there is anything that you would like to know about any of the other ballot measures, go ahead and submit a question, and we can get that up here as well. Kate?
Thanks, and I was told I wasn't eating the microphone sufficiently. So if I'm not doing that, let me know. Is that better? Okay. So as you heard, this has a very long title, but the short title is Alameda County Childcare and Early Education Measure. So all of this goes back to the fact that we have so many people, even solidly middle-class people, that are finding it difficult to find childcare that is quality childcare at a price that they can afford. And the county, for some time, has taken a lead ever since the tobacco tax was passed, if you remember that one, which created the First Five initiative, and Supervisor Wilma Chan in our county, who is our supervisor here in Alameda, was particularly interested in children and families. So she was spearheading this particular measure, which helps those low and middle income people have access to not just child care, but quality child care. These services now are partially or fully funded by the government, primarily by the state, and provided to nonprofit and public agencies by community-based organizations and individuals. You probably have heard of groups like Bananas, for example, that's based down in Hayward. That's what they're talking about, that kind of centralized service provider. Services are provided at centers and in schools, in people's homes, where they can be licensed to care for up to 14 children, and in informal settings. There are school programs, the after-school programs, like our LEAPS program here in Alameda, and others that are licensed by the Department of Education. All these child care and education providers have all kinds of regulations and requirements for staffing and facilities. They depend on the age of the child and the setting in which the care is taking place. They have to meet health and safety standards, and less so informal care that's provided by one's mother-in-law or auntie or somebody in the home, or families or neighbors that might take care of children before or after school, or in other situations where they're not licensed. But there is, in fact, a great need for low and middle income families, particularly as the need exceeds the supply, and has exceeded it for a long time. Only about a third of the children whose parents are working for $15 an hour or less have access to licensed child care or early childhood education in that kind of setting, licensed setting. Subsidies don't ever cover the full costs of quality care. Most of our current child care workers are poorly paid. They struggle to earn decent livings. They generally do not make $15 an hour or even $12 an hour. Many of them are making $10 an hour or less, which we know in the Bay Area is not a living wage. And even those that are employed in centers and as family care assistants, they're covered by the state and municipal laws about minimum wage, but health care and some of the other kinds of vacation times and all that are just not part of the way they're paid. So because of that, we all know, especially those of us that have done HR in the past, you get a lot of turnover and you get people that are not well qualified. So we have in Alameda County an Early Care and Education Planning Council, which serves as a forum to address these needs. And that includes families and the child care programs, both the subsidized ones and the non-subsidized ones. It provides a forum for the recommendation of local priorities for child care funding. It advises the County Board of Supervisors and the County Superintendent of Schools on child care program and policy issues. It's kind of a catch-all council to deal with all of these problems. The Alameda County Children and Families First Commission, which was the first 5 I talked about, happened after the passage of Proposition 10, which was the tobacco tax, and that passed in 1998. It works with other agencies and organizations to do some of this same kind of work. However, those funds have declined almost 40% because they come from tobacco tax. And the good news is the revenue from the tobacco tax has declined because fewer people are smoking fewer cigarettes, which is a good thing. However, the stream of money that was coming from that source is 40% less. So this proposal will enact a half-cent sales tax increase effective for 30 years, so it does have a sunset, from October 1st, 2018 through September 30th, 2048. The proceeds will be deposited in a special fund called the Childcare and Early Education Tax Fund and allocated by the County Board of Supervisors based on the demonstrated unmet child care and early child care needs and the county's commitment to a geographically dispersed network of child care and early education providers for these three purposes. Increase the access to affordable, high-quality child care and early education services for low and middle-income children from birth through 12 years, especially for children who are homeless and have other high-priority needs. To improve and maintain the quality of new and existing child care and early child education services throughout the county, or to improve the wages and benefits of child care providers and early educators who provide the services. There's a provision that it may not supplant, that means take the place of, money that is provided for these services in 2016-17. So there's a platform, an entry-level amount, unless the state, federal, or other non-county funding sources have been reduced. So we can't say, oh, well, we're getting that money from the state, so we'll backfill with this money, and then we won't take the state money or the federal money. There is a citizen oversight committee, and it's going to review and report on the fund's expenditures for the prior year. It has a planning and advisory council for the fund. It's most likely going to be the Alameda County Early Care and Education Planning Council. That council is a pretty interesting group. I've been reading the plan that was developed. This is the plan. It's 40 pages long. So there's a 40-page plan. They had over 100 meetings involving over 1,000 participants from all of the stakeholders in this group. And the stakeholders were parents, providers, educators, school districts, and all kinds of people that are involved in mental health services, healthcare, involved in giving these children services. So the plan happened over several years with all of these 100 meetings and all of these people involved. And it's very detailed. I have it here. If somebody after the meeting wants to look at it, they certainly can. It involves tables of where the money would be allocated, and I'll talk to that a little bit later. So that they'll become the advisory committee. The implementation is most likely going to be done by this Families First Commission that did the first 5 implementation. And this plan that the group came up with is not in the measure itself, but is something that's referred to in the implementing ordinance that says that they can go to the plan for the detail. So this 0.5% sales tax for 30 years expects to raise $140 million a year for the services that we just talked about. And all those allocations, as I said, are described in the plan. The plan will, the tax will expire in 2048. I probably won't be here then, but it says unless it's modified or extended before then. So a yes vote means purchases subject to sales tax in Alameda County will be taxed an additional 0.5%, And that'll bring the combined state and county sales tax rate to 9.75%. So it's at 9.25 now, and it'll be 9.75 after this tax if this measure goes into effect. Proceeds of the additional tax will expand and improve childcare and early education services. A no vote means that the sales tax rates would stay the same, and that the funding basis for these services will remain the same as they are now. So what do the supporters say? The supporters say that Measure A will provide safe, affordable, quality care and preschool and early child to preschool and early It'll provide quality child care and preschool to thousands more children from low and middle income families. There's now quite a long waiting list for many providers, so people just don't have access. Research shows that the critical importance of positive learning experiences to children in the first 5 years of life are critical. Measure A provides for strict accountability for the use of funds by this. There are 2 oversight groups actually involved. Better compensation will benefit caregivers and educators, help attract and retain qualified staff, and help build stable relationships essential to children. The opponents say that Measure A fails to specify the programs it'll fund. Taxpayers deserve to know how their money will be spent. Obviously, these people haven't read the plan, because I've been reading it and reading it and reading it, and that information is there. The county has failed to demonstrate sufficient accountability for the use of existing sales tax revenues. So that's what the proponents and the opponents are saying about this. It's pretty clear that people that make less money have higher turnover. Any employer can tell you that. The other problem with people on low ends of pay scale is they usually cannot afford to work and go to school to get additional training so that they can be a higher quality provider. And that's something that this measure hopes to rectify. However, it is true that in the measure, they do not have specific information about specific individuals or programs that will be funded. They're by category and not by individual. So that sign does not want to stay on that podium. Thank you. Okay, I understand, but Georgia gave me permission to go over on this one. All right. And I told her that you were from New York, but that didn't matter. Okay. Okay, so let me see. There's another. Oh, I think it might be interesting to know for the person voting on this what the percentages are of the distribution of these funds. It's intended that 3% would go to evaluation and reserve, 38% to improved quality, that is, subsidizing educational opportunities for providers, and wages. And of that, 33% of the 38%, 33% would go to base quality and wage improvement, 2% to facilities, 1% to workforce pipeline and innovation, another 1%, 0.5% to mental health support services, and 59% would go to new scholarships, and scholarships and subsidies in this are used kind of interchangeably. So it would allow a parent to offset the cost by applying for a scholarship. Of that, 41% would be new scholarships and 17.9% would be going into regional pools. So of that new scholarships money, that includes technical assistance, case management, program implementation, contract oversight, and other administrative costs. So generally, that's the outline. There is an ordinance that is intended to, it goes through a lot of whereases, a whole lot of whereases. I heard you, Marion. We do have some questions too. Okay, but I'm winding up here. Anyway, the ordinance establishes all of this, and then it says that they want to put it on the ballot. So this has been placed on the ballot by the Board of Supervisors itself. All right, and it takes a 2/3 vote. So it's a pretty steep thing. Every animal in the barnyard. Okay. Questions?
All right. Thank you so, oh, the microphone go out? Did you cut the microphone out because you thought you talked to? All right. All right.
The microphone is basically.
Okay. Better? Okay. All right, I'm going to be loud. We have questions. Here's the first one. Would church-sponsored childcare services be eligible for funding from the source? And part B of that question, would church-sponsored childcare services be impacted by programs set up by Measure A?
Church programs are already funded by the first 5 money, and it would go under the same, I would guess from what has been said in the program, that it would go under the same regulations and guidelines and be governed by state licensing rules in the same way it is now.
All right, our next question. The sales tax is hardest for low-income people to pay. Could this be financed by a property or income tax rather than a sales tax?
Generally, the county does not do income tax, so it's a county measure. So that would not happen. I would say that while sales taxes in general are regressive, basic needs like food are not subject to sales tax, at least in the state of California. So there is still that regressive nature for the people that earn less money, but I don't think the other two are an option, particularly income tax.
Actually, I'll let you stay here and I'll just.
Oh, okay.
Sorry. No, there's no microphone. What is known about the effectiveness and reliability of the potential planning and advisory council and First Five?
Okay. To my knowledge, and I've been reading up on this while I've been preparing, there are many studies that have shown that the First Five money has been very well spent in the state of California and in Alameda County, because Alameda County has done very thorough planning under the leadership of Wilma. So I think that the studies so far indicate that this kind of program with a lot of stakeholder involvement, which the plan indicates they have had all along in the planning process, has happened, will continue.
Okay. And the last question, how does the 9.75% tax
compare to other counties in the state or nationwide?
There are states in California that have 10%. I think there's one that has 10.25. Generally, at 9.75, we're in the top 10 counties for sales tax, because we have met quite a number of them that are still ongoing.
And just to give you a resource on that, if you wanted to take a look at those numbers, I was looking because I was just kind of curious. There is a California Department of Tax and Fee Administration. Website is cdtfa.ca.gov, and they have a handy little rundown on California city and county sales and use tax rates effective April 1, 2018. So if you wanted to know what cities and counties are charging right now for taxes, that would give you a big old list to take a look at.
I think San Francisco County has
Let's take a look.
pretty hefty, and Contra Costa.
There was one in Southern California that was.
There's one in I think it's one in Southern California that's the one that's over 10.
Yeah, there's one down there that's 10.
Yeah.
San Francisco. Yep. San Francisco's 8.5, but San Fernando in Los Angeles is 10. All right, so I think we're mic-less, so I'm just going to be loud and say thank you so much for your participation in this evening's forum. We hope that it's been a learning opportunity for everyone, and be sure to check out votersedge.org for more information and current articles about any of these propositions. Thanks again to the presenters, and I think George has got a couple of words to say before we head out.
Thank you. I want to give a special thank you to our voter service co-chair, Julianne Boyer, who helped organize this evening. Her cohort in crime, also a co-chair of voter service, Ken Werner. All the presenters, and to Michele Ellson, our moderator, who did an outstanding job. Again, please go to votersedge.org. You can find out more about ballot measures and the candidates, and you can find out where the money is. That's an excellent website to go see, to explore. And also the League of Women Voters of Alameda. We, again, 2 hats under our voter information is where you will find the pros and cons for the ballot measures that are from California. Regional Measure 3 is Bay Area. And then the Measure A will be a county, but they will all be on the website under voter information, pros and cons. If you're interested in what recommendations the League of Women Voters has, then you would go to a different section of our website, and that is our advocacy piece, and it's under Vote with the League, and you will see those posted, and they'll be getting posted soon. So thank you all for coming, and don't forget, Election Day is June 5th. Please go vote. Last day to register is May 21st. Democracy is not a spectator sport. Let's get involved. All right. Thank you, everyone.